the Huns. In 447 AD, as the Eastern Roman Empire struggled to rebuild after years of internal instability, a message arrived in Constantinople that sent shockwaves through the imperial court. Scouts stationed along the Danube reported a moving mass of riders stretching for miles across the plains. They did not march in formation. They did not carry banners. They advanced like a storm. At their center rode a man Roman diplomats had tried to bribe, threaten, and negotiate with for years. His name was Attila, and this time he was not asking for tribute. When the Hunnic army crossed into Roman territory, entire cities were abandoned before the first arrow was loosed. Survivors described riders appearing without warning, their horses small but tireless, capable of covering nearly 60 miles in a single day. Each warrior carried a composite bow crafted from wood, horn, and sinew, powerful enough to penetrate Roman armor at close range. The arrows came not in volleys from a fixed line, but in fluid waves from every direction. Witnesses claimed the sky seemed to darken before impact. Unlike Roman legions, the Huns did not rely on heavy infantry or rigid formations. They fought on horseback from childhood. Their saddles allowed full mobility, and their reflexes were honed through constant movement across the steppe. When Roman forces attempted to form defensive squares, the Huns did not charge blindly. They circled, they harassed, they feigned retreat, drawing soldiers out of position before turning abruptly and striking exposed flanks. The maneuver would later be described as controlled chaos, but at the time it felt like an assault from something untethered to the rules of war. Imperial records note that entire provinces were emptied within weeks. Cities along the Balkans fell in rapid succession. Walls that had protected Roman civilization for centuries offered little defense against an enemy that did not need to besiege for long. The Huns burned supply lines, poisoned wells, and left behind scorched land that made Roman recovery nearly impossible. In some regions, tax records simply stopped. Administrators vanished. Communication collapsed. Yet perhaps the most unsettling detail was not their brutality, but their unpredictability. Attila did not attempt to permanently occupy Rome. Instead, he demanded gold, thousands of pounds of it. When payment was delayed, he returned. When it was delivered, he withdrew. The empire was forced into a cycle of tribute that drained its treasury and exposed its vulnerability. To avoid battle, Rome paid. To delay invasion, Rome negotiated. To preserve dignity, Rome denied its fear publicly. But the fear was real. After one particularly devastating campaign, Roman engineers reinforced city walls and expanded frontier defenses. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched with increasingly desperate offers. Still, the Huns appeared where they were least expected. Reports describe Roman generals refusing open confrontation, aware that a single decisive defeat could fracture already fragile political structures. Attila's presence alone altered strategy across the continent. Then, abruptly, the threat dissolved. In 453 AD, Attila died under circumstances that remain debated. Without him, the Hunnic Confederation fragmented. Within a generation, their power faded. Yet the damage had been done. The Roman Empire that faced the Huns was not the same empire that survived them. If a loosely organized confederation of mounted warriors could force the most powerful civilization of its age into tribute and defensive retreat, what does that reveal about imperial strength? Was Rome weakened by Hunnic arrows, or by the exposure of structural fragility that had existed long before the riders appeared on the horizon? The Scythians. In 513 BCE, King Darius I of Persia led one of the largest military expeditions of his reign across the Bosporus and into the vast lands north of the Black Sea. His objective was clear. The Scythians, nomadic horse archers who roamed the Eurasian steppe, had conducted raids against Persian territories and disrupted trade networks. Darius intended to crush them in a decisive campaign and secure the frontier. What followed was not a battle. It was something far more destabilizing. Persian engineers constructed pontoon bridges stretching thousands of feet across rivers. Supply caravans hauled grain, livestock, and weapons deep into the open plains. The Persian army, estimated by ancient historians to number in the tens of thousands, advanced with discipline and confidence. They expected fortified settlements, defensive lines, or at least a conventional army waiting to engage. Instead, they found emptiness. The Scythians did not stand their ground. They retreated. Entire encampments were dismantled overnight. Wells were filled with sand. Grazing land was burned. Persian scouts reported distant riders observing from hilltops, vanishing before engagement could begin. Each time Darius attempted to force confrontation, the Scythians withdrew deeper into the steppe, luring the Persian army farther from its supply base. What made the situation critical was mobility. Scythian warriors were born into horseback culture. Their mounts were small but exceptionally resilient, capable of enduring harsh terrain and covering vast distances without exhaustion. Each rider carried a compact composite bow with remarkable range and penetration power. When they chose to attack, they did so in fleeting bursts, firing from horseback at full gallop before dispersing again. The maneuver, later known as the Parthian shot, though often attributed to others, had already been mastered on the steppe. Persian forces attempted to maintain formation, but constant harassment eroded morale. Arrows struck supply wagons, livestock was scattered, night raids created panic within the ranks. Yet, there was never a decisive engagement. The Scythians denied Darius what every empire relies upon in warfare: the opportunity to win visibly. Ancient accounts describe Scythian leaders sending Darius a strange message. Instead of surrender terms, they delivered symbolic objects: a bird, a mouse, a frog, and a bundle of arrows. Interpretations varied. Some claimed it meant submission to Persian rule over land, water, and sky. Others suggested the opposite, that unless the Persians could fly like birds, burrow like mice, or leap like frogs, they would be destroyed by Scythian arrows. The ambiguity itself was strategic. Psychological warfare replaced battlefield confrontation. As weeks passed, the Persian army grew strained. Supplies dwindled, horses weakened. Communication lines stretched thin across hostile terrain. Darius ultimately ordered a retreat. The withdrawal was orderly, but it was unmistakable. Persia had not conquered the Scythians. It had marched across thousands of square miles and returned with nothing to show for it. What unsettled Persian leadership was not defeat in battle, but the absence of it. The Scythians had demonstrated that an empire could be rendered powerless without ever facing its full strength. By refusing to conform to conventional warfare, they turned the scale of the Persian army into a liability. The larger the force, the harder it became to sustain in an environment where the enemy controlled movement and resources. In later centuries, Greek and Roman writers would describe the Scythians as savage nomads lacking civilization, yet those same writers recorded, sometimes reluctantly, the effectiveness of their strategy. The steppe became synonymous with unpredictability. Armies entering it risked dissolving into distance and dust. If an empire's strength depends on visible victory, what happens when victory is systematically denied? Darius commanded one of the most formidable military machines of the ancient world, yet he could not compel a scattered confederation of riders to stand and fight. When power cannot force confrontation, is it still power at all? The Parthians. In 53 BCE, beneath a relentless Mesopotamian sun, one of Rome's wealthiest and most ambitious men marched east in search of glory. Marcus Licinius Crassus, a member of the first triumvirate alongside Caesar and Pompey, sought to match their military reputations with a decisive conquest of Parthia. He commanded approximately 35,000 legionaries, reinforced by cavalry and auxiliary troops. Roman standards gleamed above tightly ordered formations. Confidence was absolute. The Parthians in Roman eyes were merely another Eastern kingdom waiting to be subdued. The confrontation occurred near the town of Carrhae, on a flat expanse of open desert that offered no cover. Roman commanders expected infantry engagement. Instead, they encountered a force built entirely around mobility. The Parthian army consisted of two primary components: heavily armored cataphracts and lightly equipped horse archers. The cataphracts, encased in layered scale armor from head to hoof, carried long lances capable of piercing Roman shields. The horse archers, mounted on swift desert horses, formed the core of the assault. As the Roman legions advanced in their traditional rectangular formation, Parthian cavalry encircled them at a distance. Drums echoed across the plain, a low thunder meant to unsettle and disorient. Then, the arrows began to fall. Parthian bows, constructed from layered horn and sinew, had a draw strength powerful enough to penetrate Roman armor at significant range. Unlike Roman javelins, which were limited in number, Parthian archers were supplied continuously by camel-mounted support units carrying thousands of additional arrows. The barrage did not stop. Roman infantry attempted to advance, but each movement exposed their flanks. When they formed defensive testudo formations, shields locked overhead, arrows still pierced through gaps. Under the heat, heavily armored legionaries struggled to maneuver. Meanwhile, Parthian riders remained beyond reach, circling, releasing volleys, retreating before counterattack could be organized. Then came the maneuver that would define the battle. Feigning retreat, Parthian horse archers turned their backs as if fleeing. Roman cavalry pursued, believing the enemy broken. Mid-gallop, the riders twisted at the waist and released arrows backward with lethal precision. The technique would later be immortalized as the Parthian shot. It shattered Roman cavalry cohesion and deepened confusion within the ranks. Crassus attempted negotiations. He was lured into a parley under the pretense of peace. Accounts differ on the exact sequence of events, but the outcome was decisive. Crassus was killed. Ancient writers recount that molten gold was poured into his mouth as a symbolic punishment for his greed, though historians debate the literal truth of this detail. What is certain is that Rome lost nearly 20,000 soldiers that day, with thousands more captured. The defeat at Carrhae reverberated across the Republic. Roman military doctrine, long centered on disciplined infantry engagement, had been humiliated by a force that refused static confrontation. The loss of legionary standards was considered catastrophic, not merely a tactical setback, but a symbolic fracture of Roman invincibility. For decades afterward, Roman leaders attempted to avenge Carrhae. None achieved complete dominance over Parthia. The Parthians did not possess Rome's infrastructure, engineering, or centralized administration. They did not maintain permanent legions and fortified camps. Their strength lay in adaptation to terrain and mastery of speed. Where Rome relied on order and discipline, Parthia relied on fluidity and endurance. Carrhae was more than a battlefield loss. It was a revelation, a reminder that heavy infantry superiority could be neutralized by a force unwilling to meet it head-on. Rome's expansion eastward slowed. Campaign planning grew more cautious. Diplomacy replaced invasion in some sectors. If the Roman war machine could be dismantled in open terrain by riders who never fully committed to close combat, what does that say about the limits of structured military power? Was Carrhae an anomaly, or proof that empires built on rigid systems are vulnerable to those who refuse structure entirely? The Goths. In 378 AD, under a sky thick with late summer heat near the city of Adrianople, the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens prepared for what he believed would be a manageable confrontation. The Goths, a confederation of displaced Germanic tribes seeking asylum within imperial borders, had been granted entry years earlier under strict conditions. They were to be settled, taxed, and absorbed into the Roman system. Instead, corruption among Roman officials left them starving, exploited, and armed. By the time Valens marched out to face them, the Goths were no longer refugees. They were an organized war host. Roman scouts reported that the Gothic encampment was surrounded by wagons arranged in a defensive ring, a makeshift fortress known as a lager. Valens, eager for personal victory before reinforcements from the Western Empire could arrive, chose to attack immediately. He commanded an army of roughly 15,000 to 20,000 troops, composed of heavy infantry, cavalry, and auxiliaries. Confidence remained high. Rome had faced tribal uprisings before. This would be another suppression. The initial assault met resistance but not collapse. Roman infantry pressed forward, shields interlocked, advancing uphill toward the wagon ring. Yet, unknown to Valens, a significant portion of the Gothic cavalry had been absent from the encampment at dawn. They were foraging. As the Roman legions engaged the defensive perimeter, dust rose on the horizon. The Gothic cavalry returned. What followed unfolded in brutal efficiency. Gothic horsemen crashed into Roman flanks at full charge. Unlike previous enemies Rome had absorbed or defeated, these warriors were not loosely organized raiders. They had adapted. They carried long spears and heavy shields, and they attacked in coordinated waves. Roman cavalry units faltered first, breaking formation under pressure. Once the mounted protection dissolved, infantry formations were exposed. Ancient accounts describe chaos as the heat intensified. Roman soldiers, packed tightly together, found maneuvering impossible. Orders were drowned in noise. Arrows and javelins struck from multiple directions. The disciplined structure that had defined Roman warfare became a trap. Bodies fell in layers, making retreat nearly impossible. By late afternoon, Emperor Valens himself was either struck down on the field or trapped in a farmhouse that was set ablaze. His body was never conclusively identified. An emperor of Rome had died at the hands of those once considered manageable migrants. 2/3 of the Roman army present were killed or captured. The Battle of Adrianople was not merely a tactical defeat. It exposed systemic weakness. Rome had relied increasingly on federated tribal troops to supplement its legions. Internal political fragmentation had strained command structures. The Goths demonstrated that a tribal confederation, when unified and motivated, could match imperial organization in direct confrontation. In the years that followed, Rome attempted to negotiate coexistence. Gothic groups were settled within imperial territory under semi-autonomous status. Yet this integration came at a cost. Authority blurred, loyalty divided. By 410 AD, another Gothic leader, Alaric, would march into Rome itself. The Eternal City, once thought untouchable, was sacked for the first time in nearly 8 centuries. Historians often frame the fall of Rome as a slow decay driven by economic strain, political instability, and overexpansion. Yet Adrianople stands as a turning point where imperial confidence shattered publicly. The psychological impact of an emperor dying on the battlefield against a tribal force reverberated through military planning and political calculation. The Goths did not possess Rome's bureaucracy or engineering marvels. They did not command vast treasuries, but they adapted quickly, unified when pressured, and exploited imperial arrogance. If a displaced confederation could not only resist Rome but kill its emperor in open battle, what does that reveal about the balance between structure and adaptability? Was Rome defeated by external force or by the consequences of underestimating those it sought to control? The Vandals. In June 455 AD, as internal political turmoil paralyzed the Western Roman Empire, sails appeared on the horizon off the coast of Italy. The city of Rome, once protected by legions and fortified borders stretching across continents, now faced an enemy approaching from the sea. The Vandals, under the command of King Genseric, had crossed from North Africa with a fleet assembled not from a grand imperial navy, but from a once migratory tribal confederation that had reinvented itself as a maritime power. The Vandals were not originally seafarers. Decades earlier, they had moved across Europe as a Germanic tribe, eventually crossing into North Africa in 429 AD. There, they seized Carthage, one of the wealthiest and most strategically vital cities in the Mediterranean. By capturing its ports and shipyards, they gained access to maritime infrastructure that Rome had neglected. Within years, the Vandals had built a fleet capable of projecting power across hundreds of miles of open water. When their ships anchored near the mouth of the Tiber River, Rome was unprepared. The imperial court had fractured after the assassination of Emperor Valentinian III. No unified defense awaited the incoming force. Genseric did not storm the walls in a traditional siege. Instead, negotiations were demanded and granted. For 14 days, Vandal forces systematically stripped the city of its wealth. Gold, silver, sacred relics, and thousands of captives were loaded onto ships and transported back to Carthage. What made the sack of Rome in 455 uniquely destabilizing was not just the loss of treasure, it was the demonstration that the Mediterranean Sea, once described as Mare Nostrum, our sea, was no longer under Roman control. The Vandals attacked shipping routes, intercepted grain convoys, and raided coastal settlements from Spain to Sicily. Roman trade networks, dependent on maritime transport, began to fracture. Contemporary writers portrayed the Vandals as destroyers, emphasizing chaos and plunder. Yet, closer analysis reveals calculated strategy. By controlling North Africa's agricultural heartland, particularly its grain supply, the Vandals effectively held Rome's food security hostage. A city reliant on imported grain could not sustain itself without secure sea lanes. Roman attempts to retaliate were costly and largely ineffective. In 468 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire launched a massive naval expedition to reclaim Carthage. Ancient sources suggest the fleet included over 1,000 ships and tens of thousands of troops. It was among the largest amphibious operations of antiquity. The Vandals responded with fire ships, unleashing burning vessels into the tightly packed Roman fleet. The result was catastrophic. Hundreds of ships were destroyed. The financial loss nearly bankrupted the Eastern treasury. The Vandals did not match Rome's population or industrial capacity. Their advantage lay in seizing a critical choke point and transforming it into leverage. They did not need to conquer all of Italy. They only needed to control the arteries that sustained it. By the early 6th century, the Vandal kingdom would fall to Byzantine reconquest. Yet by then, the Western Roman Empire had already collapsed. The Vandals had demonstrated that control of infrastructure could be as powerful as battlefield supremacy. They had turned mobility and maritime disruption into strategic weapons. If an empire depends on interconnected supply systems, how vulnerable does it become when those systems are severed? Rome's walls remained standing in 455, but its illusion of dominance over the Mediterranean did not. When a former migratory tribe could project power across open seas and cripple imperial logistics, was Rome defeated by invasion or by the exposure of its own dependencies? The Mongols. In 1221, refugees flooded the fortified city of Nishapur in northeastern Persia with a warning that sounded exaggerated even by wartime standards. Entire regions to the east had vanished. Cities with walls 40 feet high had been breached in days. Armies larger than any local force had been shattered. The attackers did not establish permanent capitals, nor did they negotiate treaties. They arrived, destroyed resistance, and moved on. They called themselves the Mongols. Before the formation of a centralized empire, the Mongol steppe clans were fragmented groups bound by kinship and rivalry. Yet, under the leadership of Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, these tribes were reorganized into a highly disciplined military machine. What distinguished them from other nomadic confederations was not merely horsemanship, but structural reform. Units were organized in decimal formations, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, ensuring flexible command across vast distances. Each Mongol warrior typically maintained multiple horses, sometimes 3 to 5, allowing continuous movement across hundreds of miles without exhausting a single mount. Scouts rode ahead in wide arcs, mapping terrain and monitoring enemy mobilization. Communication relied on mounted couriers, capable of traveling up to 200 miles in a single day through relay systems. When the Mongols reached the borders of the Khwarezmian Empire, they initially sought trade agreements. After diplomatic envoys were executed by the Shah, retaliation followed with calculated ferocity. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Those that surrendered were spared mass destruction, but subjected to strict control. The pattern was consistent. Psychological warfare preceded physical assault. Refugees were deliberately allowed to escape to spread stories of devastation. The Mongol assault on fortified cities challenged long-standing military assumptions. Siege engineers from captured territories were integrated into Mongol forces. Catapults, battering rams, and even early forms of gunpowder weaponry were deployed. Walls once thought impregnable were reduced methodically. Defenders who relied solely on static fortifications discovered that mobility outside the walls had already been lost. At the Battle of Kolka River in 1223, a coalition of Rus princes and Cumans pursued a retreating Mongol force across open steppe for 9 days. Believing victory imminent, they advanced without unified coordination. The Mongols reversed direction in a sudden counterattack. The coalition army was encircled and crushed. Commanders were reportedly executed beneath wooden platforms on which Mongol leaders held a victory feast, an act meant to symbolize complete dominance. What made the Mongol clans terrifying to established empires was not their brutality alone, but their adaptability. They absorbed engineers, administrators, and scribes from conquered territories. They learned siegecraft from China and fiscal management from Persia. Speed and structure coexisted. Yet at their core, they retained the steppe principle of fluid warfare. They rarely tied themselves to a single geographic center. When resistance stiffened in one region, forces reappeared thousands of miles away. Europe first encountered Mongol armies at the Battle of Legnica in 1241. Polish and German knights were overwhelmed by coordinated cavalry tactics and arrow storms. before they could deploy effectively. The Mongols did not resemble traditional tribal raiders, nor did they fit the mold of sedentary empires. They represented a hybrid force capable of moving across continents with logistical precision. Fortified cities that had endured centuries of warfare fell within months. Trade routes shifted. Political maps were redrawn across Asia and Eastern Europe. If walls, distance, and numbers could not slow a force that combined nomadic mobility with structured command, what defenses remained viable? Did the Mongol surge reveal a new model of power, one that made static empires appear outdated in the face of relentless motion? The Zulu. In the early hours of January 22, 1879, British troops encamped beneath the rocky slope of Isandlwana Hill in southern Africa believed they faced a limited tribal resistance. The British Empire had deployed modern Martini Henry rifles, artillery pieces, and disciplined infantry formations to confront what they considered a technologically inferior opponent. Intelligence reports underestimated both the size and organization of the Zulu army assembling beyond the ridge. What unfolded that day became one of the most devastating defeats ever suffered by a modern imperial force at the hands of a tribal war host. The Zulu military system, known as the impi, had been transformed decades earlier under the rule of Shaka Zulu. Young men were organized into age-based regiments, trained intensively in close combat, endurance running, and coordinated maneuver. Weapons were simple but optimized for shock engagement. The Ikelwa, a short stabbing spear with a broad blade, was designed not for throwing but for thrusting at close range. Large cowhide shields allowed both protection and offensive pushing within tight formation. At Isandlwana, approximately 20,000 Zulu warriors advanced in a formation later described by observers as the horns of the buffalo. The central chest pressed forward to pin the enemy, while two flanking horns extended outward, encircling from both sides. British forces, numbering roughly 1,800, including auxiliaries, were stretched thin across open ground. Ammunition distribution became uneven as the engagement intensified. Initial rifle volleys inflicted heavy casualties on advancing Zulu ranks. Yet the impi did not collapse. Warriors used terrain folds and tall grass to minimize exposure. They advanced in waves, closing the distance despite gunfire. Once within close quarters, the numerical advantage became decisive. British bayonets and rifles proved less effective when surrounded on multiple sides. Accounts from survivors describe the sudden realization that retreat paths had been cut off. The encirclement was nearly complete within hours. The discipline of European linear warfare faltered under the pressure of coordinated flanking. By late afternoon, the British camp had been overrun. Over 1,300 imperial soldiers lay dead. Artillery pieces were captured. The Union Jack fell in the African dust. The defeat stunned London. How could a force armed with industrial-era weaponry be annihilated by warriors carrying spears and shields? Investigations pointed to logistical errors and overconfidence. Yet the structural lesson ran deeper. The Zulu impi had demonstrated that tactical cohesion, speed, and encirclement could neutralize superior firepower under specific conditions. The Zulu kingdom itself would eventually fall later that same year, after reinforcements and heavier artillery were deployed. But Isandlwana left a mark on imperial military doctrine. Defensive perimeters were redesigned. Encampment procedures were revised. The psychological assumption of automatic superiority had been shaken. The Zulu were not a nomadic raiding party. They were a militarized society built around regimental identity and collective discipline. Their shock tactics relied on synchronized movement and absolute commitment. Warriors ran for miles before engaging, conserving energy for the final charge. Once contact was made, they aimed to collapse formation rather than engage in prolonged exchange. Isandlwana did not dismantle the British Empire, but it exposed the vulnerability of structured armies operating in unfamiliar terrain against adversaries who understood speed and encirclement. If disciplined rifle volleys and artillery could be overwhelmed by coordinated movement and numerical pressure, what does that suggest about the balance between technology and tactical design? Was Isandlwana a failure of British command, or proof that imperial power could be punctured by a force built entirely around momentum? The Comanche. In 1786, Spanish officials in New Mexico signed a treaty not with a neighboring kingdom, but with a nomadic power they could neither defeat nor fully contain. The Comanche, masters of the southern Great Plains, had forced colonial authorities into negotiation. After decades of relentless raids, settlements had been abandoned, trade caravans attacked, ranching economies destabilized. Despite the presence of muskets, cavalry detachments, and fortified presidios, the Spanish frontier bent under sustained pressure from a people without cities or permanent walls. The Comanche transformation began in the early 18th century with the acquisition of horses, initially introduced by the Spanish themselves. Within decades, the tribe had reoriented its entire society around mounted mobility. Children learned to ride before they could walk steadily. Warriors could fire arrows accurately while galloping at full speed. Each fighter often maintained several horses, allowing rapid movement across hundreds of miles of open prairie. Unlike European armies that required supply lines and centralized command, Comanche war parties operated in flexible bands. They struck at dawn or during storms, targeting livestock, supply depots, and isolated settlements. Raids were not random. They were calculated to weaken economic stability and project dominance across contested territory. Captives were taken and assimilated or traded, further expanding tribal influence. By the mid-18th century, the Comanche controlled a vast region later referred to as Comancheria, spanning present-day Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and parts of Kansas. This territory functioned as a de facto horse empire. Spanish officials recorded that even heavily armed patrols avoided deep incursions without significant reinforcement. Trade routes between Mexico City and Santa Fe became hazardous. Firearms did not immediately tip the balance. Early muskets were slow to reload and less reliable on horseback than bows. Comanche riders exploited this limitation, closing distance rapidly before soldiers could reset formation. Spanish cavalry, though experienced, struggled to match the endurance and speed of plains-mounted warfare. When Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, the instability along the northern frontier intensified. Comanche raids penetrated deep into Mexican territory, reaching as far south as Durango. Entire villages were evacuated. Military expeditions launched in retaliation often returned without decisive engagement. The Comanche avoided pitched battles, preferring economic attrition. By the time the United States expanded westward in the mid-19th century, it encountered a region already shaped by Comanche dominance. American military officers quickly realized that conventional infantry formations were ineffective across the plains. Fort networks were constructed, and cavalry units were reorganized specifically for frontier warfare. What distinguished the Comanche from other tribal groups was not merely skill in combat, but strategic control of trade and movement corridors. They dictated who could cross certain regions safely. Even rival tribes adjusted migration patterns to avoid confrontation. Eventually, the combination of sustained military campaigns, bison extermination, and epidemic disease would erode Comanche power by the 1870s. But for over a century, three separate political entities, Spain, Mexico, and the United States, faced a mounted force that operated beyond fixed borders. The Comanche did not establish stone capitals or bureaucratic institutions. Their strength lay in mobility, environmental mastery, and decentralized coordination. They reshaped geopolitics across thousands of square miles without drafting a single constitution. If imperial expansion depends on securing territory, how does one secure land dominated by riders who can appear and vanish across open horizons? Was Comancheria an empire in everything but name, or proof that sovereignty does not always require walls and flags? The Apache? In 1885, a small band of Apache warriors led by Geronimo slipped off a reservation in Arizona territory and vanished into the mountains. The United States government responded with one of the largest manhunts in its frontier history. Nearly 5,000 soldiers were deployed to track fewer than 150 men, women, and children. Cavalry units scoured canyons. Telegraph lines transmitted sightings. Supply depots were established across deserts and ridgelines. Yet for months, the Apache remained elusive. The Apache homeland stretched across harsh terrain spanning present-day Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. It was a landscape of jagged mountains, arid valleys, and narrow passes. To outsiders, it appeared barren and unforgiving. To Apache warriors, it was an intricate network of escape routes, water sources, and vantage points. Apache combat doctrine differed fundamentally from conventional military structure. They avoided large-scale engagements and focused instead on calculated strikes against isolated targets. Small groups moved silently through difficult terrain, sometimes covering 40 to 50 miles in a single night. They carried minimal supplies, relying on intimate knowledge of the land to find water and concealment. United States cavalry units, though mounted and better equipped, struggled with logistical constraints. Horses required fodder and water. Soldiers needed regular supply chains. The Apache could disperse into small units, regroup unpredictably, and cross international borders with little warning. When pursued, they used elevated terrain to monitor approaching forces and select advantageous engagement points. Reports from soldiers describe sudden ambushes followed by immediate disappearance into rocky outcrops. Gunfire echoed across canyon walls, making it difficult to determine direction. Apache warriors understood acoustic distortion within narrow valleys, using it to amplify confusion. At times, they attacked supply trains rather than troops, targeting the operational backbone of military campaigns. What made the endurance campaign against the Apache uniquely destabilizing was the duration. Each time military commanders announced progress, the band would reappear miles away. Cross-border pursuits into Mexico complicated jurisdiction. Diplomatic tensions rose as U.S. forces chased Geronimo's group deep into foreign territory. The psychological dimension intensified. Settlers feared isolated travel, ranches fortified perimeters, newspapers sensationalized every encounter. The cost of pursuit climbed steadily, far exceeding the immediate threat posed by a relatively small group. By September 1886, after months of relentless tracking and dwindling resources, Geronimo surrendered. Yet the military expenditure required to subdue a small mobile band revealed a structural vulnerability. A nation with railroads, repeating rifles, and telegraph communication had mobilized thousands against dozens. The Apache did not rely on heavy weaponry or large-scale formations. Their advantage lay in stamina, adaptability, and environmental integration. They could survive in regions that weakened conventional armies. Rather than seeking territorial expansion, they aimed to maintain autonomy through evasion and selective engagement. The endurance campaign became a study in asymmetry. Victory required overwhelming numbers and sustained pressure over time. Even then, the cost was disproportionate to the scale of resistance. If a modernizing nation with industrial infrastructure must deploy massive force to contain a small group operating through terrain mastery, what does that reveal about the limits of centralized power? Was the Apache defeat inevitable, or was it achieved only by exhausting a structure built for mobility rather than conquest? The Sea Peoples. In 1177 BCE, inscriptions carved into the walls of the Egyptian mortuary temple of Medinet Habu recorded an invasion unlike any pharaoh had faced before. Ramses III described enemies arriving by land and sea, their ships cutting through the eastern Mediterranean, their warriors accompanied by families and wagons. Entire regions, he claimed, had already fallen. Hatti was destroyed. Cities in the Levant burned. Kingdoms that had endured for centuries vanished within a single generation. The attackers were not a single nation. They were referred to collectively as the Sea Peoples. Archaeological layers across the eastern Mediterranean support the narrative of sudden disruption. Cities such as Ugarit show evidence of violent destruction. Clay tablets found in final archives record desperate pleas for military assistance that never arrived. Trade networks collapsed. Bronze production, reliant on long-distance tin supply, diminished rapidly. Within decades, the interconnected system that had defined the Late Bronze Age disintegrated. What makes the Sea Peoples particularly unsettling is the ambiguity of their origin. Egyptian reliefs depict warriors with distinct feathered helmets, round shields, and long swords. Their ships were advanced, capable of transporting large groups across open water. Some scholars propose they were displaced populations from the Aegean or Anatolia. Others suggest a coalition formed from migrating tribes responding to environmental or economic pressures. Unlike earlier tribal incursions that targeted frontier zones, the Sea Peoples struck at the structural core of established civilizations. They attacked ports, trade hubs, and river deltas. By severing maritime routes, they undermined economic stability across multiple kingdoms simultaneously. Egypt itself narrowly repelled their advance. Ramses III reorganized defensive positions along the Nile Delta and staged a coordinated counterattack. Relief carvings show captured enemies and broken ships along the riverbanks. Yet even Egypt emerged weakened. Subsequent pharaonic power diminished in scale and influence. The convergence of destruction across Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and Canaan within a short time frame suggests coordinated movement. Some cities were abandoned rather than rebuilt. Writing systems disappeared in certain regions for centuries, marking what historians later termed a dark age. The Sea Peoples did not establish a unified empire. They did not leave monumental capitals. Their impact is measured primarily in absence, in the sudden silence of once thriving centers. The lack of centralized command may have been their strategic strength. Without a single political target, retaliation became diffuse. Imperial systems built upon interconnected trade proved vulnerable to multi-directional disruption. When shipping lanes became contested and overland routes unsafe, the entire framework of diplomatic and economic exchange unraveled. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of the most debated periods in ancient history. Climate shifts, internal rebellions, and economic strain are all cited as contributing factors. Yet the visual record of coordinated maritime assault is difficult to ignore. If loosely organized migratory coalitions could dismantle multiple civilizations in overlapping waves, what does that imply about systemic fragility? Were the Sea Peoples the cause of collapse, or the catalyst that exposed deeper instability across an already strained network of empires? The Numidians. In 203 BCE, as the Second Punic War reached its decisive phase in North Africa, Roman commanders prepared for a final confrontation with Hannibal's Carthaginian forces near Zama. Rome's survival had been tested for over a decade. Entire legions had fallen in Italy. The war had strained the Republic's manpower and treasury. Yet, in the decisive battle that followed, one factor shifted the balance more than infantry strength or siegecraft. It was cavalry. And at the center of that shift stood the Numidians. The Numidians were a tribal confederation inhabiting the arid regions of modern-day Algeria and Tunisia. Their warriors were light cavalry riders, renowned for exceptional speed and maneuverability. Unlike heavily armored mounted troops, Numidian horsemen carried minimal equipment. A small shield, javelins, and a short blade formed the standard kit. They rode without heavy saddles, relying on balance and agility rather than rigid control. Before Zama, Numidian cavalry had fought on both sides of the conflict. Their allegiance shifted according to regional alliances and internal rivalries. What made them strategically invaluable was their ability to dominate open terrain. In contrast to Roman cavalry, which operated in more structured formations, Numidian riders excelled at fluid harassment. During the Battle of Zama, Numidian cavalry under the command of Massinissa allied with Rome. As the main infantry forces clashed, Numidian riders engaged Carthaginian cavalry on the flanks. Their tactics emphasized speed over direct collision. They threw volleys of javelins, withdrew, regrouped, and attacked again from alternate angles. The Carthaginian mounted units were drawn away from the central battlefield. At a critical moment, the Numidians returned to the main engagement zone. They struck Hannibal's infantry from the rear, collapsing defensive cohesion. Roman infantry, which had been locked in frontal combat, suddenly found Carthaginian lines destabilized by flanking pressure. The combined effect proved decisive. Hannibal was defeated. Carthage's capacity to wage large-scale war against Rome effectively ended. The Numidians were not a sedentary empire with monumental cities or bureaucratic depth. They were tribal horsemen whose mastery of open ground altered the outcome of one of antiquity's most significant conflicts. Rome would later incorporate Numidian cavalry techniques into its own military system, recognizing the necessity of adaptable mounted units in frontier warfare. What makes the Numidian example distinct is that their influence did not stem from territorial conquest, but from tactical leverage. They demonstrated that speed and maneuver could outweigh heavier armor under the right conditions. By controlling flanks and disrupting mounted balance, they amplified the effectiveness of allied forces. In subsequent decades, Roman expansion across North Africa relied heavily on alliances with Numidian rulers. Yet this relationship was fragile. Internal conflicts within Numidia occasionally destabilized Roman strategy in the region. The same mobility that aided Rome could also threaten it if loyalties shifted. The lesson from Zama was not solely about Roman resilience. It was about adaptation. Rome learned that rigid military systems required flexible complements. Light cavalry became essential for maintaining dominance across diverse terrain. If a tribal cavalry force could tip the balance of a war that determined Mediterranean supremacy, what does that reveal about the hidden weight of mobility in imperial conflict? Was Rome's victory at Zama a triumph of legion discipline, or evidence that no empire survives without borrowing from those it once underestimated? The Dacians. In 101 AD, Roman Emperor Trajan led a massive army north, across the Danube River, into the rugged Carpathian Mountains. His objective was clear. The Dacians, a tribal confederation occupying what is now modern Romania, had repeatedly raided Roman territories and challenged imperial authority along the frontier. Unlike previous tribal opponents, however, the Dacians were not loosely organized bands. They had fortresses carved into mountain ridges, complex defensive networks, and a king whose name had already become a concern in Rome's Senate. His name was Decibelus. The first campaign exposed a difficult truth. Dacian strongholds were positioned on high elevations connected by narrow passes. Roman legions, accustomed to open battlefield maneuver, found themselves navigating steep terrain under constant threat of ambush. Dacian warriors wielded a distinctive weapon known as the falx, a curved blade capable of reaching over Roman shields and striking unprotected limbs. Contemporary Roman accounts describe helmets reinforced with additional metal bands after early engagements revealed how devastating the falx could be. Decibelus employed both conventional resistance and irregular tactics. When Roman forces advanced, Dacian fighters retreated into fortified positions. When Roman engineers began siege construction, Dacian raids targeted supply lines. The Carpathian terrain complicated Roman logistics. Roads had to be constructed across rocky slopes, bridges reinforced under constant threat. Trajan ultimately forced temporary submission in the First War, but the conflict reignited within years. In 105 AD, Rome returned with even greater force. The scale of the Second Campaign was immense. Tens of thousands of troops were mobilized. Massive siege engines were transported across mountainous terrain. The bridge over the Danube, engineered by Apollodorus of Damascus, stood as a symbol of Rome's determination to project power deep into Dacian territory. The final assault on the Dacian capital of Sarmizegetusa was methodical. Roman forces cut water supplies and breached defensive walls. Decibelus fled, but was eventually cornered. According to Roman records, he took his own life to avoid capture. Dacia was annexed and reorganized as a Roman province. Yet the cost was substantial. Casualties were high. Resources were stretched. The campaign required one of the most extensive mobilizations of the early imperial period. Even after annexation, maintaining control over Dacia demanded continued military presence. The Dacians were not a nomadic force dependent on speed alone. They had developed fortified centers integrated into mountain terrain. Their resistance combined geographic advantage with tactical innovation. The falx forced Rome to modify armor design. Mountain warfare demanded new engineering solutions. Trajan commemorated his victory with a monumental column in Rome, carved with spiraling reliefs depicting the campaign in meticulous detail. It stands today as both celebration and warning. Victory was achieved, but only through overwhelming deployment and adaptation. Unlike the Sea peoples who dissolved into history, the Dacians were absorbed into the imperial structure, yet their resistance required Rome to invest heavily in conquest. The annexation provided access to Dacian gold mines, partially offsetting the cost. But it also extended Rome's defensive perimeter further into difficult terrain. If subduing a tribal confederation required massive infrastructure, prolonged warfare, and structural adaptation, was the expansion truly a display of imperial strength, or a sign of strategic overreach? How many victories of empire come at a price that quietly reshapes the victor as much as the vanquished? Conclusion. These warrior tribes reveal a disturbing pattern that stretches across centuries and continents. From the Hunnic riders on the Danube to the Dacian fortresses in the Carpathians, from Scythian horse archers on the open steppe to Zulu regiments advancing across African plains, each confrontation exposed something deeper than battlefield loss. These were not isolated clashes between civilization and so-called barbarism. They were structural stress tests, and empires failed more often than they admitted. In nearly every case, the imperial power possessed advantages in population, metallurgy, engineering, and administration. They built walls hundreds of feet long. They raised legions disciplined by years of training. They controlled treasuries measured in tons of silver and gold. Yet when confronted by mobility, environmental mastery, and tactical unpredictability, those advantages shifted into liabilities. Heavy armor slowed pursuit. Centralized command delayed response. Long supply lines became targets instead of strengths. There is a recurring dynamic. The tribes did not need to conquer entire territories permanently. They disrupted trade arteries. They denied decisive battles. They exploited terrain the empire could not fully control. Some killed emperors. Others forced tribute. A few triggered collapses that historians would later attribute to economic or political decline. But the pressure often began at the frontier, where imperial structure met adaptive resistance. What emerges is not a romantic image of noble warriors, nor a condemnation of empire. It is a recognition of imbalance. Empires depend on predictability, on taxation schedules, supply chains, formal command structures, and fixed geography. Warrior tribes thrived in unpredictability. They moved faster than bureaucracy could react. They struck where infrastructure was weakest. They understood that destabilizing confidence could be as powerful as winning territory. The larger the empire grew, the more it depended on coordination across distance. And distance is precisely what mobile tribal forces manipulated. A fortress can defend a city. It cannot defend an entire frontier at once. A legion can hold formation. It cannot pursue indefinitely across open plains without cost. The question is not whether these tribes were stronger in absolute terms. Most were eventually subdued, fragmented, or absorbed. The deeper question is why so many empires required transformation after encountering them. Why Roman armor changed after the Dacians. Why frontier strategy shifted after the Comanche. Why naval doctrine evolved after the Vandals. Perhaps the lesson is uncomfortable. Power that relies too heavily on structure may struggle against forces that refuse structure. Civilizations often imagine themselves as stable, permanent, and superior. Yet history shows that adaptability, not scale, determines survival. If loosely organized tribes repeatedly force the most advanced empires of their age to rethink strategy, surrender gold, or even collapse, what does that suggest about the nature of dominance itself? Is civilization inherently resilient, or does it merely appear so until confronted by something faster, leaner, and unbound by its rules? And if that pattern repeats across time, the real question may not be how empires fall, but how long they can ignore the warning signs on their borders before the riders appear on the horizon again.